Hello, and welcome to the dungeon. I'm your host, Rob. In today's video, we're finally going to be finishing off our series on the multi-classing tier list. So that means we have finally gotten to Wizard. So, Wizard's kind of a hard one to combine with a lot of other classes. Part of this is because Wizard's already one of the strongest classes in the entire game. And a lot of times it kind of feels like, anything we do that delays our Wizard progression is really just kind of hurting us in a lot of ways. It's sort of like taking away from our core instead of adding to the core. And that's just kind of an awkward feeling. That being said, there are still some pretty good combinations with Wizard, but I sort of feel like Wizard also has another drawback, which is that it uses intelligence. And most of the other classes that we might want to combine with are using things like charisma for other casters or wisdom for other casters or, strength or dex, right? And those can still work with Wizard, right? If we want to make a more melee focused character. But again, the more levels we're putting into something else, the more it's delaying our spell progression. And as the campaign tends to get to higher and higher levels, the more high level spells really start to impact the game. And, the more that decision to postpone or delay or give up higher level Wizard progression starts to, really, really hurt. So Wizard's kind of a hard one where it's hard to justify a lot of times taking something else over just taking more Wizard levels. That said, there are some combinations that we definitely want to talk about. So, that's going to be the purpose of this video. Before we get too deep in, I might as well explain the ranking system. As always, we're just using the basic internet tier system with A, B, C, D, and E, and above them all is the S tier, reigning supreme. As always, I like to point out that I am rather stingy with my S's. I know there's a lot of people who sometimes complain that something I put in the A tier they think should have been an S tier. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that I'm right and you're wrong. It doesn't mean that it's not S tier. It just means that I felt that there's other stuff that I just put, just a little bit above it necessarily, right? But anything I put in the A tier means that I think it's an excellent build still. So that's the ranking system. Now, the main three reasons are to multi-class. I always like to review these as well. I have three main reasons. There can be other ones as well, of course, right? But the main three, number one is to double down on my core role or my core proficiency, right? So in other words, I'm going to take one class that does something really well, combine it with another class that does something really well, and then just get the best of both worlds, right? Reason number two, and this one is particularly applicable to Wizards, and that is to cover for weaknesses in the class. So while we already talked about high level spells, Wizards tend to be a lot more vulnerable at low levels, especially like first and second level. You do have some nice defensive spells like Shield and Absorb Elements, and these are really good if you're only facing a couple encounters a day and you can use Shield, in those encounters all the way through kind of thing, right? But let's say you're doing a dungeon right at level 1, and maybe you're going to go through 6 or 8 encounters. You can't use Shield in every encounter, let alone use it, in every round of every encounter. And suddenly your character is a lot more fragile and vulnerable. You have no armor, no shield. You have 6 hit points plus whatever your con mod is, which is the worst in the game, by the way, tied to Sorcerer, right? So, starting as something else that maybe gave you, say, a fighter, for example, where you're getting 10 hit points instead of 6 plus your con mod, right? You're getting any armor you want, possibly heavy armor, even if that's how you wanted to go. You're getting a fighting style, that can be a nice way to start your campaign, especially if the Dungeon Master did warn us we're going to be doing a dungeon right at level 1, and I'm a little worried that, I don't really feel like dying right off the bat. That can be maybe a decent investment. You also get Constitution saving throws, which means you're going to have proficiency on concentration saving throws. And that can be a big deal. But again, remember that this is coming at the expense of what you really want to be doing, which is casting spells. So these trade-offs aren't, they're not win-win necessarily like they were in category 1, right? Where you're taking the best of both. This is more like you're giving up something to get something else that you also kind of want, but it's more of a, 60-40 type of thing. Reason number 3 is to gain more versatility or, utility for yourself and for the party. And this is still a good reason to multi-class. I personally like playing really versatile characters, right? I like being able to do a lot of things and fill in places where maybe the party was lacking something, especially if I don't know what anybody else is going to play, or if I don't know, don't know how they're going to play, or maybe I do know how they're going to play, and that's why I feel like I need to be able to cover for some of these other people. That's always a possibility as well. The reason though why I rank this as the lowest is because you're not playing in a bubble. You have other party members who could be filling those roles, and somebody who specializes in that role is always going to be better at it than somebody who just decided to dip one toe into performing that role. You're just never going to be as strong as somebody who's dedicated to it. And one thing to remember in D&D, it is a group function. It is a party, right? You don't have to be excellent in every category. As long as somebody is excellent in that category, your party is going to be pretty good. So anyways, those are my main 3 reasons. So let's get into the main core of the video now, which is looking at the different classes. So starting in alphabetical order, number 1, we have the Artificer. And as luck would have it, Artificer is actually one of our stronger combinations with Wizard. It's one of the only ones that uses intelligence, which is pretty nice since that's what we're using as a Wizard. There's also some specific combinations we might like say grabbing the Battlesmith, for example, and combining it with, say, like a Bladesinger Wizard can be pretty interesting. Any of the Artificer subclasses have something to offer, which I kind of like. Infusions at level 2 is kind of nice. It's the only half caster that starts being able to cast spells, which is actually a really big deal if you wanted to take things like the Warcaster feat. If you wanted to start Artificer, get some better armor options, get Constitution saving throws, this could be a big reason why you might want to go this way. Because unlike other half casters, like say the Paladin or the Ranger, they don't start with spells. And in order to be able to take Warcaster, we need to have the ability to cast spells already. So this could be a big reason why we might want to go Artificer over some of these other options. The only reason I didn't put this in the S tier is because I sort of feel like the more Artificer levels we have, kind of feels like the worse this gets though. And that's kind of a bad feeling for me. Again, it's only a half caster and it is delaying our Wizard progression. And even things like attacking with intelligence on a Bladesinger, while cool, that could have just been 3 more levels of Bladesinger we had. That is kind of a lot to be giving up. It's one that I feel is really, really good at lower levels, where maybe those 1 or 2 or possibly 3 levels of Artificer, oh man, that's a lot. It does add a lot, but as we start getting to higher and higher levels, we just find we start wishing that we had those levels in Wizard instead. So that really kind of stopped me from putting it in the S tier. But I do think that in a more low-level focused campaign, starting with like say 1 level of Artificer and then going Wizard is pretty good. And even if we wanted to dip a 2nd level for infusions, that could be okay. That's starting to hurt more though. But like I said, the higher level we get, the worse it kind of starts to feel to me. So I'm putting it in the A. I was kind of borderline with S, but as always, if I'm borderline with S, it doesn't get an S. So next we have the Barbarian. Barbarian though, there was no borderline about it. It was a solid E, unfortunately. Yes, it can give us some, if we started Barbarian, we could get 12 hit points. And we could have Rage. And that does seem, we could have medium armor. That does seem to cover some of those weaknesses we mentioned on Wizard earlier. But it all comes at the expense of being able to cast any spells at all. And man, that's just a lot to give up, especially on somebody who wanted to be a spellcaster. In the end, there's really just, no reason to choose Barbarian over some of the other options we had, like Fighter, for example, right? So Barbarian, I'm sorry, but probably not a surprise to anybody. Barbarian gets an E. Next we have the Bard. Bard is a hard one for me to rank because it does have a lot to offer. Getting more skills, jack of all trades, expertise, subclasses, Song of Rest, having some nice spell casting that in a lot of cases differs a lot from the wizard spell list, right? It can really diversify our spell list a lot, but it is pretty multiple attribute dependent or mad. If I refer to something as mad, just remember that that's what we're talking about in this case, meaning we're needing a lot of different stats. So we're needing intelligence on the wizard, but we're needing charisma on the bard. You're probably still needing some dexterity and probably some constitution as well. It starts getting to be a lot of different ways to split our stats. And while the bard spell casting is nice, again, I don't know that it's better than what we would have had just by going wizard. I do think there's some interesting niche builds. Like, let's say we want to go College of Swords and combine that with Blade Singer. We can get some blade flourishes and stuff. We can get a fighting style, which we normally wouldn't have available. I do think that there's some interesting options there, but at the end of the day, I think Bard itself is just a D with some niche builds that might be above that, right? So like, College of Swords with Blade Singer, I think might be a C or possibly even a B if you really want to min-max it a lot. But, just Bard in general, I don't think that it's really offering a lot. It is still a pure caster. It is still contributing overall to our spell progression from our spell slots. It's just not helping us to gain those higher level wizard spells faster, which is, often what I'm really looking for. So in the end, I feel like Bard, it does offer us some stuff, and I think in interesting builds, it could still be okay. It's just not as much as I might have wanted. Anyways, moving on. Next we have the Cleric. Now, Cleric is a little more interesting to me than Bard. Again, it is a pure caster, which is nice, but it also gives us a subclass right at level 1, and it gives a domain feature right at level 2. And depending on the build, these could be kind of a big draw. Like an Evoker Wizard combined with, like, say, 2 levels of Tempest Cleric, and then you use your Channel Divinity to, like, maximize the damage on all your lightning bolts, potentially. That could be a fun build, right? And it's not a big commitment when you also consider we could be getting things like armor, potentially even heavy armor, a shield, etc. like that. I think that a Necromancer combined with Death Domain Cleric gives us some interesting options as well. I find that a lot of times I might have a spell I'm concentrating on, and then after that I'm often relying on cantrip damage. So why not cast Toll the Dead on 2 targets, as long as they're 5 feet away or less, while concentrating on my main spell that I'm using? I think that it's pretty thematic. I'm already a Necromancer, now I'm combining with a Death Domain Cleric. That's interesting. And, if I'm going to be spamming a lot of cantrips while letting my undead army attack, and then maybe concentrating on, like, a control spell or whatever else, that could be worthwhile for only a 1 level or even 2 level investment, right? In the end, I feel like Cleric is probably a B, but I do think that some of these other niche builds we've talked about could push into the A tier. Druid. Druid is interesting. It does give us a lot of interesting spell choices. It does give us a subclass at level 2 instead of 3, and earlier is always better when we're looking at dipping, right? Not as good as Cleric, mind you, but I think there's some potential there. Unfortunately, one of the big draws for Druid might be Wild Shape, so we have more proficiency in that exploration pillar of play. But I find that a familiar could have done much of the same thing, and we already have Find Familiar on our spell list. So that does give you a lot less incentive for Druid than a lot of the others do. I actually put Druid in the C tier, but as I talk about it more, I think it might actually be a D tier even. I'll leave it in C just because that's where I ranked it, but there's less and less there the more I look at it. Like, really, I'm not sure that I'm justified in ranking it above Bard at this point. The more I think about it, I'm like, I don't know. Bard might actually be better still. But either way, I put it in C. I'll just leave it there for now. I have seen somebody play in a one-shot a Conjurer Wizard combined with Circle of the Shepherd Druid, and I believe it was a pretty high level one shot. It might have been even a level 20 one shot that I watched on YouTube. And so they had 14 Conjurers, 6 Druid, and it was really good. They had an excellent summoning character. But I also want to say though that playing something in a high level one shot is a completely different experience than leveling that character up step by step, week after week, game after game, month or year by year, right? That's a completely different experience. And so I don't really know how that would play out. 6 levels of Druid is a pretty big Druid commitment. So, I don't know. Like I said, it's pretty hard to justify all those levels if you're not playing in an already, in a one-shot campaign where you don't have to level it through. Anyway, moving on. Next we have the Fighter. Fighter, I mean, it's not going to be surprising that I give this a pretty good ranking. We've already mentioned Fighter in an example of a way to get Constitution saving throws and better armor and a shield and more hit points all at level 1. That is pretty good. But if that was all Fighter gave us, I don't know that I'd really give it a super high ranking. It would probably still be maybe a B or even a low A. But Fighter has one other thing going for it that nobody else does, and that is Action Surge. Action Surge is the only way we can cast a leveled spell and then follow it up with another leveled spell in the same turn. And especially as you get higher and higher level spells, this just becomes completely game breaking, honestly. I think that especially as we get to higher levels, this one might actually be S tier. I didn't want to put it in the S tier though, because I also feel like it doesn't perform as well in lower tiers where you're now pushing all your spell casting back. In the end, I think that it's an interesting balance if we look at the two that we've put in A tier so far, not including specialized cleric builds. We've got the Artificer, which I think is actually up here above Fighter at lower levels. But as I mentioned, the Artificer actually feels worse as we level, and the Fighter feels better as we level. So I think that balance of power shifts the higher level our campaign gets when we can now cast multiple, 5th, 6th, 7th, or 8th or level spells or whatever. I mean, maybe not multiple of the same spell rank because we only have, probably one of those spells. But you know what I mean? Like a 6th level spell, Action Surge, and a 7th level spell, or, whatever, right? It just gets ridiculously strong. So in the end, I gave Fighter an A, mostly because I think that at lower levels, putting back our spell casting progression is still a big deal. But, as you get better in spells anyways, it starts looking a lot better. I especially like the idea of just taking the 1 level Fighter, getting to like level 5 Wizard, and then maybe getting back into Fighter for that 2nd level, right? I should probably also point out, this isn't Fighter specific, but things like Polearm Mastery do work with a staff. So you could be beating on people with Staff of Power potentially, right? Or Staff of the Magi or whatever, and using that with Polearm Mastery still. Is it better than just casting high level wizard spells? Probably not. And the one case where we might have wanted to do this might be a Blade Singer, but now you're using a staff and you kind of needed a sword. So, not great there either, unfortunately. But, you know, I mean, just saying, you take the duelist fighting style, you got pull on mastery, yeah, there might be something there for like a fighter abjurer wizard, potentially. You know, like I said, though, pull on mastery is not fighter specific. That was just a random thought that I didn't even write down. It just popped into my head now, and now I spent too long talking about it. Anyways, moving on. We have the monk. Target monk. It's just another case where you offer us very, very little compared to the other martials. You're not giving us armor options. Yes, you could get the unarmored or the unarmored defense ability from monk, but that's going to use wisdom. So now you're needing intelligence for wizard, dexterity, and wisdom, and still needing some constitution, of course. Oh man, that's a lot. The other thing is that like key points are actually pretty useful, you know, being able to fuel different cool abilities. I don't actually have a problem with that. The problem is that they tend to go really, really rapidly, and unlike, say, sorcery points, they just tend to be a lot less impactful on a battle. I mean, you can still quicken cast a high-level spell with sorcery points, and that spell could be a complete game changer for that combat. Extra movement, or even like, you know, or whatever, just isn't a big deal. Stunning strike, you know, especially on a class like wizard where you've already got good mobility through your spells often, and you're playing at range usually. Stunning strike's requiring us to make some sort of like melee attack, which maybe we wanted to do, but in most cases, no, you know. So overall, I just feel like a few niche builds aside, maybe with like Bladesinger again, potentially, Monk's just an E. Again, because especially if you're a dipping monk, you're not going to have a lot of key points to go with. It's just not a great fit. Next we have Paladin. And I feel like Paladin was another hard one for me to rank, because adding smite to something like a Bladesinger is actually potentially pretty good. The problem is that what's Paladin really giving anybody besides Bladesinger? I mean, sure, you could be getting some armor and weapon proficiency, some shield, you know, stuff like that. It's got more hit points. But Fighter could have given us all those same things. And Fighter could have also given us Action Surge. The problem is that I also have a hard time justifying combining Paladin with Wizard when I could have just gone Sorcerer instead, or even Warlock. But Sorcerer especially, we've got a lot of overlap with the Wizard spell list, and then we're just needing Charisma. Why am I going Wizard with this and then dipping Paladin? I just don't feel like it's a great mix. Overall, I think it's a D. I do want to give a clear exception, though, where Bladesingers being able to smite, that's actually pretty decent. So I do think that one's much stronger, probably even a B. Maybe even stronger still, who knows, honestly. But just overall, combined with the, you know, the majority of wizard subclasses, there's just really not a lot there to draw me. So Paladin, overall, you're getting a D. Next we have the Ranger. And I feel like a lot of the same problems we have with Paladin, the fact that we're needing Charisma and intelligence for Wizard, we're needing some strength on a Paladin. You know, Ranger's having a lot of those same problems, except that there's not even things like smites to draw us here. We could potentially get like expertise in a few different areas if we're using the optional rule from Tasha's, which I assume most of us probably are, right? There are a few interesting spells to draw us potentially, like Hunter's Mark could be okay in certain builds, right? But again, it's pretty niche, and I think there's even less to draw me here than there is with Paladin. So I don't want to go below a D. I already gave Paladin a D. Maybe Paladin could have missed C. I don't know. We're leaving it as a D. This one's going to be a D as well. Like I said, a few specific combinations aside, I just feel like there's not really a lot to pull me in here. Rogue. So Rogue gives us some skills, expertise, cutting action, sneak attack if we're making sneak attacks, you know. Those could all be pretty decent. Overall, I feel like this combination is probably about the same as Bard, or maybe even inferior, but there are a couple things that do kind of draw me to Rogue. If it was only one subclass, I would definitely rank it below, but the truth is that both Arcane Trickster and Assassin can be pretty good builds combined with Wizard. And Assassin may seem less obvious, but anything that's using an attack roll can be combined with our Assassin ability to get advantage on all those attacks if our opponent hasn't acted yet. So not too long ago, I did a Sorcerer build where we looked at combining like Sorcerer with Hexblade and with Fighter, so we could make like a Scorching Ray Blaster type character, right? But an interesting alternative to that is to make a Evoker Wizard who does kind of the same thing using blasting spells, but combined with Assassin, and then just giving ourselves advantage on all those like Scorching Ray attacks that we wanted to make. That can be potentially pretty nice. You could even combine it with some of those other ones we looked at, like say the Hexblade or the Fighter, but now you're splitting a lot of ways. One advantage of just going Assassin, though, is that you're just getting advantage on all those spell attacks. And I do think that's a pretty interesting alternative, especially if you went Bugbear again, and now your Scorching Rays are doing 4d6 with advantage. That can be interesting. And of course, Arcane Trickster gives us a lot of interesting options as well, using like Booming Blades or Green Flame Blades or something like that, but having much stronger spell casting than we would have had from just going Arcane Trickster. Either way, I think both of those are decent builds. I don't know that they're like even A tier, but I think that they're probably both B tier builds. So I think, overall, Rogue would probably be a C or maybe even a D, but, we'll put those two builds definitely a step or two above. So then we have the Sorcerer. Sorcerer is interesting because it has many of the same drawbacks of the other casters we've already talked about, but it does have a few advantages that they don't. If we compare it to, say, the Bard, right? Again, now you're needing Charisma and Intelligence. Not great. But Sorcerer does get Constitution saving throws if we start Sorcerer. That's at least something. It also gives us a subclass right at level 1, which should not be overlooked. And of course, it gives us meta magic. And even if you don't have a lot of sorcery points, let's say you just take 3 levels of Sorcerer. Let's say we start with Sorcerer, go into a bunch of Wizard, go to, say, Wizard 5, and then go back to Sorcerer for a couple levels, get some meta magic, and then just go all the rest of the way Wizard, for example, right? It does mean that whatever we want to do with that meta magic is probably a one-trick pony, but combined with higher level spells, that can be pretty useful still, A hold monster that we decide to hide and cast can be pretty strong. Now, is it so strong that we couldn't have just gone Sorcerer instead all the way? Like, if you really want sorcery points, I feel like you might as well just go Sorcerer. But I don't think it's the worst option you have in the world. Wizard does give us a lot of summoning options, and, your summoning spells, even though they last an hour, a lot of times, you're exploring a dungeon, you search a bunch of rooms, you lose your spell, you get into the next room, you have a surprise encounter. I mean, not that you're surprised, I just mean, an encounter you weren't expecting. Being able to quicken cast that summon is pretty nice, right? So, I do think that there are at least some reasons to maybe go Sorcerer. In the end, I decided to put Sorcerer as a B, which is probably a little on the generous side. It's kind of borderline between B and C, but honestly, I don't have anything to beat here right now, which, at least not, excluding some of the niche builds we've talked about, right? Which is probably not the best reason, but I do feel like, start with con saves, you get a subclass, like, there are some other things there, not just meta magic. But then when you combine meta magic with that, you're like, maybe there's enough here. I still don't know that it's better than just going straight Wizard or straight Sorcerer, honestly. But, there are worse options. At the end of the day, it is a heavy commitment though, so, you know, use it with caution. Anyways, finally that brings us to the Warlock. And Warlock is another one that I'm kind of stuck in that Bard type of territory, right? Like, it's not that it's bad, it's just there's not really a lot of reason to really go here, you know? Unlike, say, Bard or Cleric or Druid, our spell slots aren't stacking with our Wizard spell slots because Pact Magic is its own separate thing. And that kind of actually hurts this multi-class combination. We also, sure, we can get better armor from some specific subclasses, but overall, like, just getting light armor wasn't that much of an improvement over robes, for example. So again, there's not really a lot here to draw me in general. Things like Eldritch Blast. While a lot of multi-classes might want Eldritch Blast as a good spammable damage source, it's not great on a wizard where I need intelligence for my casting, but Eldritch Blast is going to use charisma. You know, again, unlike, say, a sorcerer who dips Warlock for Eldritch Blast and Agonizing Blast, that at least makes sense. You're just using charisma all the way through, or a bard, for example, right? But as a wizard, it just feels kind of bad. At the end of the day, I don't know that there's really a lot here, and that kind of wants the D tier, I think, as a good ranking. There might be some exceptions, like you could make an Evoker who grabs a level of Hexblade just for Hexblade's Curse. One nice thing about Hexblade's Curse is that, unlike, say, Hex or even Hunter's Mark, it's not a spell. So you could use that as your bonus action and then cast, say, a Scorching Ray or your Magic Missile or whatever it is you're trying to cast, right? Because Hexblade's Curse is not a spell, you're still eligible to cast a leveled spell as your action, right? And, you know, being able to add some damage equal to proficiency bonus is pretty good. Critting on a 19 or 20 if you're using a spell with an attack roll is pretty good. It's better than just a 20, right? So I do think there's some niche builds in there where maybe Hexblade would work well with, say, Evoker Wizard, right? But overall, I just don't think it's that strong. Now, I do want to point out that I did read about on a forum somebody who went with a Necromancer Wizard and combined it with Warlock 5 specifically so they could get those 2 short rest 3rd level spell slots, and they used them for more castings of Animate Dead because they were in a campaign where they knew they'd have frequent short rests and they could just get that skeleton army or zombie army, whichever one they're going for, up even faster. And I do think that's a cool idea. I just don't know that it's good enough in general to really sway me on this. Again, I think this would fall into those like niche builds where you have a specific idea in mind that you want to be able to exploit, and I think that that's okay as an idea or as a concept. You know, you're focusing more on your undead army than you are on, say, your spell casting at higher levels, right? And, you know, if that's how you want to play it, I think that's perfectly fine. I just don't know that it's enough that, in general, I'm going to, you know, recommend it, that kind of thing. It falls into that category of things that are cool as a, you know, snapshot of like a level 20 or higher level build, rather than something you have to play all the way from the ground up, I think. But anyways, that's going to cover that. So to sum everything up, let's look at our overall rankings. In the S tier, we have nothing. In the A tier, though, I won't bother going through all the different niche builds that we've mentioned, but in the A tier, we have our Artificer and our Fighter. In the B tier, we have Cleric and Sorcerer. In the D tier, or C tier, we have Rogue, Druid, and in the D tier, we have Bard, Paladin, Warlock, and Ranger. And then the E tier, we have Monk and Barbarian. So yeah, that's going to cover it for the Wizard. In the future, I'm going to do a couple more videos where we look at like a couple of different Wizard subclasses we haven't looked at. I know I've never done the Scribes Wizard, which I find kind of interesting. So we'll definitely look at that. We'll probably look at some Wizard multi-class as well. But I also wanted to talk about a lot of other stuff in general. I'd like to give my thoughts on some of the new Wizards of the Coast stuff that they've been putting out for their 5.5 or D&D Next or 6th edition or whatever it's going to be that we call it in the future. Probably looks like D&D Next is what they're calling it or whatever, right? Because I have a lot of interesting thoughts on some of this stuff, but I haven't really had a chance to express them yet because I've really wanted to just finish this off and get it out of the way, right? Also, the more opportunity we give them, the more release stuff, the more we have to talk about, right? So I think that could be okay. Like I said, I've ordered a microphone, so hopefully that will be here shortly. I ordered it from Amazon, who's usually pretty good, but I am in Canada. I'm not worried about Amazon, it's more Canada Post. I've had times where stuff shows up in a timely manner. I've had other times where they, call you and say, oh, hey, we just found this parcel of yours that was sent 8 months ago, and we don't know what happened to it. But we found it now, so congratulations. You can come get it. They're not even going to send it to me, of course, right? So, hopefully, Canada Post issues aside, I'm sure everything will be fine. My tax dollar is hard at work, right? Anyways, I'm also hoping to do some interviews of some other YouTubers, like I mentioned. I'd like to talk to some other people about, D&D 1, or whatever it's going to be called. 6th edition, as it's going to be basically, I think. But whatever. And, I think those could be some interesting conversations. So, I do look forward to a lot of this stuff in the near future. But anyways, that's everything I have for now. Thank you for watching. Feel free to like, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, and most importantly, leave me your comments in the comment section. I look forward to reading them. To this day, I still read every single comment I get, even if I don't necessarily respond to all of them. But anyways, that's everything. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.